Much for the kind invitation. It's great to be back a second time early in the year when Franklin Public Library reached out to me, giving me the topics for the year. I said I can speak on this, and that. So I didn't think that I was going to be invited for 2 presentations. So I'm very delighted to be here. And I also am becoming quite familiar with some of the faces, so I really appreciate that some of you keep coming back, so that's quite a treat. So the topic that I'm going to be discussing today is a very current topic, but it doesn't normally make the news, but we were just discussing via email, and right now that it's been in the news lately, and I got invited to give a presentation on a related topic in a couple of places in addition to this. So there seems to be a lot of interest out there, so that's fantastic, because the topic is not going to go away. So before I get started, I will give you maybe my 3 goals for the presentation today before giving you my arguments. So one of them is to offer a little bit of background and clarity on what are some of the key terms that we use, what is going on. The second one is to evaluate what is happening, what are we doing to address this issue. And the third one is really based on my own experience. It's just maybe a few recommendations or thoughts, but that doesn't mean the world is going to move in that direction. Hardly ever follows my recommendation. So with that, once you hear this, you probably should assume that it's not going to go that way. But the reason why I will suggest what I will is based on legal precedent, because one of the things that we do, particularly there's going to be a lot of legal background to this, is we normally build on experience, we build on precedent, and that's more or less where my recommendations are going to go. But as I said, there's many ways of moving forward, and only time will tell what direction we go. So I'm going to start by introducing the person who actually wrote the essay that comes with the booklet this year. I always like to do that and acknowledge who they are. So the person who wrote the piece is a very prominent researcher on migration and law at Tufts. Tufts is one of the universities that specializes in international relations with a particular focus on law and diplomacy. So they have some of the best legal scholars of diplomacy in the world. So she's definitely up there, and she's really specializing on the study of refugees, migration, climate, weather, etc. So very, very interesting essay, very simple as well, and I really like the way that she takes such a complex topic and puts it in very simple terms. I'm going to borrow some of her ideas here, but most of what I present today is really my own analysis and my own ideas, but I really will start with some of the ideas that she gave us, and I will point that out for you, and then I'll tell you at what point I'm fully responsible for what you hear today. So the structure of my presentation, it's going to be divided into 4 sections. First, I'm going to open with some key terms that are commonly used by the people who present on this topic. Then I will address the question of why people move, which actually the person who wrote, the scholar who wrote the essay, does a very good job discussing, so I will go through that fairly quickly. 3, the legal framework. I'll be spending a little bit more time on that. She advances a few ideas in the essay, but I feel that there's a lot more that I wanted to add to that. So number 3 is probably going to be the core of my presentation, and 4, maybe it's my recommendations, but as I said, feel free to leave after 3 because my recommendations are never followed. So don't waste your time if you need to go to dinner. Okay. But do stay if you want to see, the way the world is not going to go. So key terms. So some of these makes it into the essay. So clarifying what we mean, what technical terms we use is important. And one of the challenges that we have with migration and climate change is that we don't really have agreement on what terms we use and which ones we should, work with. So we see the term eco-migrants, we see the term environmental refugee, climate displacés. Normally in international law, we use a lot of French terminology, so displacé is people, it sounds pretty much like English, those who have been displaced. So those are some of the terms that we're using. Scholarship seems to be galvanizing around what I put there in bold, the idea of climate mobility. And the reason for that is because not everybody who moves due to climate would consider themselves as a refugee or a migrant or a displacé, even though they probably would consider themselves one or the other. So it does justice for us, at least to start with a little bit of a broader term, to basically signify the idea that climate change is causing people to move. And in that perspective, and that's why climate mobility is important. And this is mobility that is caused by environmental conditions, not necessarily climate change. And one of the things to keep in mind is by climate change, we mean a number of different phenomena that are caused by the greenhouse gas effect, the rising in average temperatures, which cause more evaporation, which causes more precipitation, but those phenomena are not evenly distributed around the world and they manifest themselves differently. So I will not be spending a lot of time on climate change per se, because this is not the goal of the presentation. It's more on the legal aspect of what do we do about a phenomenon that is gaining momentum in the world. So another thing that's important is that when it comes to people, climate change is probably normally not the immediate cause or something. It's what we call a stressor. And that really makes it a little bit harder for us. Most people who move would probably claim that I'm not moving because of climate change. I'm not moving because it's hotter today than it was yesterday. But it's very likely that there's a number of structural conditions that make life very difficult that then climate exacerbates to the point that people make the decision of moving on or moving over to a different place. So again, it's very hard to prove that there's immediate connection between climate change and mobility, but climate change is one of many factors that lead people to move. Okay. So, why do people move? So I have a couple of quotes here that are really, really important. When we talk about climate change and climate policy, we normally argue that we have to think about climate policy, what we do at two levels. One is what we call mitigation. We have to try to put an end to the causes of climate change. But it's going to take a long time for us to eliminate those emissions and to retire those greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, which means that the changing weather conditions are going to be with us for a while, which leads to the second approach, which is adaptation. Changes are here to stay, so we need to adjust to those changes. But that doesn't mean that we have to give up on eliminating the causes of those changes in the first place. So from that perspective, it is very important for us to think about this quote that comes from one of the prominent student of migration, climate, motivated migration. And the idea is that migration may be an adjustment mechanism of first resort, or a survival mechanism of last resort. And that's really important for us to think about. People don't necessarily like to move unless they choose to do that. People normally develop lives, lifestyles, family, social network connections in places, and that takes a lot of time to build. And that's part of what makes life fun and gives us quality of life. So enduring a disaster that will force us to move is incredibly traumatic to people. And people will only do that as an adjustment mechanism of first resort. If I do not move today, I might die tomorrow. I will think about everything else later and everything that I leave behind. And that's when survival comes in. I can no longer go back because I can no longer sustain my lifestyle. I can no longer sustain life in the place given the changes that I'm witnessing. So it's very important for us to think about this. And the key here is that normally policy and law tend to go behind these real life conditions, which means that normally we don't have the legal or policy instruments to address a problem that is becoming more and more prominent. And in part, we don't have it because we don't know exactly what's good policy and we don't know what kinds of legal mechanisms would be ideal to actually give those tools to the people who actually might need to use them. As I mentioned, maybe as a survival mechanism of last resort even, which makes the issue very important. So why do people move? So they move for survival ultimately, but there's a number of reasons that we need to think about. Moving is not easy. For us to move somewhere, we have to have the financial means to pay for transportation to get there, unless we will walk. But when we're talking about a major natural disaster, walking is normally not going to get us out of trouble. It's not going to get us far enough. Which means we have to have technology. We call technology a car, a bicycle, a plane. So we have access to that, and that is expensive as well. We have to have the political resources. We have to be allowed to move to a safer place. We have to have the cultural resources. We normally like to move to people who talk like we do, who understand our culture, who are more likely to empathize and help us. It's very hard to start from scratch in a very different place where you don't know anybody, don't speak the language, don't know the culture, don't like the food. Very, very difficult. It's a very tough decision. You have to have knowledge to know when it's over. You can no longer live here, and you have to know where conditions might be better, where people will welcome you, where you can start from scratch, where you can find the opportunities for yourself and for your family. Again, all of these are really important resources that are not readily available to the people who all of a sudden are affected by a traumatic event and they need to make a decision overnight. So it gets more complicated. Networks as well. People normally work with friends and family or with work networks. When tragedy hits you, sometimes you don't have that. And if you don't have that, then you cannot move. So for us to move, we need to have all of those conditions in place, which means that most people who would like to move do not, because they don't have that. So it's very important for us to keep that in mind. Many people who will be affected by tragedy will not be able to move because they just don't know how or they can't. They don't have the resources. Which means that if we really want to help them, we have to get help there. Very few will actually have the means to move. And that is normally what we talk about when we talk climate-based migration or environmental-based migration. So most people do stay and rebuild. But if climate change is the cause of the calamity that caused the problem in the first place, and maybe the first idea that moving might be an option, if the conditions don't change, it's very likely when people rebuild, they're going to be hit again. At what point do these people realize that rebuilding is not an option? They just don't have the resources, the savings to rebuild again. And at what point do they actually realize that they need to have access to all of those resources to move? Those are very difficult questions. I'm not necessarily asking you to settle those, but those are things that go through people's mind before they decide to move. So moving is difficult. Moving takes a lot of time and resources. So when people move, they've thought through this, unless they fled for their lives. Okay, so staying by choice normally only happens if people have faith in their community, that their community has the financial resources that they need, the technical resources that they need, the social capital that they need, the people willing to help, the political institutions that will be there to help them if they don't have what it takes. So all of those things are really, really important. When given options, people will choose to stay. People move when they don't see any other opportunities and have the resources to move. And one thing that is really, really important, people get attached to their places. People like the looks of the neighborhood. People like the looks of the streets. They're familiar to them. People like the restaurants that they like to go to. It's very hard to move. There's a lot of cultural capital that comes with that. And moving might actually mean that you leave all of that behind. You will never be able to go back to those places where you once were happy, where you built a family, the places that you call home. Your culture. Moving for many people means cultural genocide. It's the end. People move, you split up, and the people who build a culture with you will go to different places, and they will merge into different cultures, but your culture, as you remember it, will disappear. Those are traumatic causes. We call that cultural genocide. So again, think about these when trying to explain why people move. Displacement versus migration, those are two important concepts. Both involve people moving, but involve people moving for different reasons. So by displacement is what we mean when people are forced to leave suddenly because of a sudden catastrophic event that creates threatening conditions to their life, to their infrastructure, to their people, to their way of life. And when it comes to climate, we normally think of these as extreme weather events. A major rain event, flood event, hurricanes, tornadoes, those kinds of events, wildfires, which are becoming a little more common now. Migration is not something that happens quickly. As I mentioned, migration is something that's planned. When people migrate, they pack up and leave for good or for a good chunk of time. So it takes thinking, it takes planning, it takes analysis of what you're gonna leave behind, what you're going into, and then you calculate, is the risk of the unknown worth giving up everything that I already have? And if your decision is, yes it is, for whatever reason, then do you have the resources to invest to move? So displacement, immediate need to move out of harm's way. Migration, a very, very, very well-crafted plan to improve your living conditions in the long term when you've made the decision that staying put is probably not gonna make things easy. It's probably gonna get worse. Both are people on the move, both require that we have legal and political means to help people who do that. And we don't. We have some, but they're not ideal. So again, different reasons why people move, but we do have to have the means to help with that. So what are we looking at here? So where do people go? Most people move within their country. So most weather events that cause people to move out of harm's way, they normally will say within 1 or 2 miles. The majority of people, talking 90% of the people. If there is flooding going on in your neighborhood, you just move to higher ground, 2 blocks away. That's really where it all ends. Then you make decisions. Okay, is it safe to go home? Is it safe to rebuild? And if the answer is yes, you just go home. Okay, you dodged the bullet for now. So for most people, it happens that way. Most migration, when people decide to pack up and leave, it normally means people leave rural areas and they move into cities. In cities, there is more money, there is more wealth, potentially more jobs, and more opportunities. So most people who are affected by weather events in the rural areas, if they made the decision that life is no longer sustainable, they normally will give up farming and move into the cities and try to make a living there. In urban areas, if your neighborhood floods, most likely you're just gonna move next door. So that's normally the way people do. Very few people will move to a different town. You've got a job, you've got your friends, you've got your family. Why would you uproot everything and move? Just move to higher ground. I normally use this because the most common impact of climate change in the Midwest is flooding for the most part. Those are sudden onset events. They happen all of a sudden. They're becoming more severe because of climate change. There's more moisture in the air, more energy, and the result is more extreme weather. Slow onset, such as climate change, is something that has been happening, has been brewing for about 2.5 centuries, and it's going to continue to go. So in this case, when people decide to move because of these slow onset events, something that keeps happening regularly, it seems to be getting worse. Not every year, but every decade, every 5 years, every 2 years, something hits us, which is not quite traumatic, but it seems to be getting worse. At some point, you decide that this trend is just going to continue to get worse, so we move. And we move to those places where we can start anew without going too far. Again, I really emphasize this. People are attached to their families and friends, their culture, their way of life, so they're going to try to stay very close. Another argument that I really want to bring up is that climate change, if it is real, it's happening everywhere. And while most of the reading that we have in the booklet today is international, so this is happening in the United States. We have a community in the US that has already been moved. It's almost underwater. It's been there for centuries, and the community itself is being eroded by the Gulf of Mexico, the rising waters. The decision was made by this community and the state of Louisiana and the federal government to just move them to higher ground. And they're in the process of doing this. I don't know if you have heard of this, but we do have a number of communities that are considering this. This is the one that's officially moving due to climate change. And the state of Louisiana is investing a lot of money to help them move. I mean, look at the erosion going on. They lost most of their ground from 22,000 acres of land about 50 years ago. They're down to 350. Very likely a hurricane will just take everything that's left there. So they've made a decision to move. But they're not the only ones. So this is a very serious problem. About 260 million, this is actually comparable to the US population, have moved outside of the country of birth. And as I mentioned, those are very, very well thought through, difficult decisions that people make. Leaving home is difficult. Leaving home for a different country is very difficult. Unless you're crazy like me and you're a student and you get a scholarship and you say, I'm gonna see the world, for me it was a very easy decision. But I'm not the norm. I mean, most people like me get a scholarship, you go to college, you're really learning. I'm not talking about that. It's people who decide to move because they just don't see a way to make a living, to be safe in the places where they're born. So very difficult. 4.6 million of those people are moved because they fear for their lives. They fear political persecution, they fear political violence, they fear violence on the streets where they live. And about 31 million, and this is very hard to estimate, so take this data with a huge degree of caution. But about 31 million have been displaced by weather-related events. And not all of those are because of climate change. One of the things to keep in mind, I teach environmental studies at Beloit, and very often my students talk about natural disasters. There's nothing disastrous about nature. Nature has its ways. What we mean by a natural disaster is a human disaster. It's because we build a city of 1 million in the floodplain. Well, of course, when it rains, it's going to flood the area. That's what it's meant to do. That's not a natural disaster. That's a natural process. But if we build there, it's going to be a disaster, a human disaster for the people who live there. So it's very important for us to think about, and many of the people who are displaced by weather events are probably people who live where they do because of poor planning, because of poor economic, political decisions that were made at some point for other people normally, not necessarily for them. So these people have to deal with the consequences of poor decisions made by other people, which just makes it even worse because they're incredibly vulnerable, and they're very likely going to be people who probably wouldn't have been in harm's way had they actually known and had proper planning been done. Because the nature of climate change, if you look at trends, temperatures keep rising, which means there's going to be more moisture, more evaporation, the ice is melting, more water in the ocean, warmer temperatures, more melting, more evaporation, more rain, more precipitation, more tornadoes. So we're expecting to see these weather events to happen more often, which means that we're likely to see more people being hit by them, people deciding to move, either because of an immediate catastrophe, or because in the long run they think that it's coming again. So, which means that because this is a problem that is affecting millions of people, and it's likely to affect more people, we probably should start planning and think about ways to deal with this. Think about ways to make these kinds of moves more organized, the climate mobility, as we mentioned, so that the people who have to move are not left to their own resources, and the communities that receive them are not left to their own resources or to the mercy of their neighbors, so that we actually have a mechanism in place so that these kinds of transitions are a little easier. We do have a growing body of international agreements, some legislation by which international communities are coming to an agreement as to what we should do. One of the challenges is that international relations is based on the principle of state sovereignty. The idea that this goes back to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, that put an end to the 30 Years' War, by which the states have decided that we are fully sovereign over whatever happens within our borders. So we have the right to decide who comes in and who doesn't. We have the right to decide what we do within. The problem is people do cross borders. Even if you don't want it, they do. And then how do we deal with that? And if these kinds of events hit some countries harder than others, we should expect that some people will try to leave those countries. And that is going to happen. There's a trend through history, people move. Most people don't, but some people will. We're talking millions, and we know they continue to move. So how do we facilitate that so that the move is as easy and untraumatic as possible for the people who move and for the receiving communities? So here's a few ideas. One of the arguments is the concept of climate refugee. So this is a concept that has gained some international momentum. The United Nations Environmental Program has actually told us since the 1980s that people are moving because of weather conditions, extreme weather, and that we should acknowledge that and make arrangements for that. And they call those people climate refugees. Okay, so that's one option. So let's think about that. So if we actually do call people climate refugees, what kinds of legal instruments, protections, political tools can we give them to to actually make sure they get out of harm's way as soon, effectively, cleanly as possible, so that the trauma is minimized. Okay, so we do have a few protections here. So if we call them refugees, then we do have a body of international law, the 1951 Refugee Convention, relating to the status of refugees, which was improved in 1967 with the protocol, that basically tells us the following: that a refugee is someone who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside of the country. The rest doesn't pertain too much to climate refugee. Is climate targeting people on the basis of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group? Does flood the houses of Republicans but not the Democrats? Or vice versa? It doesn't work that way. So there's limitations to the use of the term refugee from a legal standpoint, because refugees are people who are persecuted for their ideas and who have to leave, because if they don't, they won't be free, and they might even be killed or incarcerated. So these happen in the context of the Cold War, post-Holocaust, the terrible things that happened in Europe in the 1930s into the 50s, to basically help people get out into the West for the most part. It was an initiative by the countries that won World War II that was very much promoted by the powers who won, particularly the Western liberal tradition, US, United Kingdom, to open the door to those wanting to migrate out of Cuba, out of the former Soviet Union and the eastern part of Europe. But because climate refugees don't meet this definition, they're people who must leave their countries, but not for those reasons. This argument has some significant problems. Most people who move because of climate do not cross national borders. So this definition is not going to help them. They do not flee political persecution, so this definition doesn't help them. The government is not persecuting them. Their governments might have done something that made the problem worse, but the government didn't intentionally target them. The government didn't ask the rain to fall in a particular part of town on a particular ethnic group. So this does not hold any water, not even when it doesn't rain. And the countries where most people are living are not the ones who are actually causing the problem. The people who are actually moving out of a country because of weather conditions, because of climate, tend to go to the countries that have the highest standard of living, which are the ones that caused the problem in the first place. So that is a parody, and it's an irony. So this does not fit the definition of refugee. So, however, we can't just throw out the definition. The definition provides a legal precedent for the idea that sometimes people must leave their country of origin to protect their lives, to protect the things that they cherish the most. And the international community could and should do something about that. So that is the legal precedent. So the Refugee Convention does tell us that. So what if we broaden the definition? And that's pretty much where we're at today. Let's broaden the definition and say refugees are welcome. We all have to make room for them. Well, interestingly enough, not everybody likes refugees. Okay, so he certainly made it very clear some other politicians don't like refugees, but they're not as honest. So there is lack of political will to say, hey, those 40 million people who've been displaced by climate change should come to the US because we welcome them with open arms. What politician is going to get elected on that agenda? That's probably not politically feasible. So not just because of him, but also because most of the American people will probably not want to take in 40 million people at the same time. Some countries in the world have done that, have taken an equivalent amount of people due to migration because of disaster. For example, Colombia very recently took in about 3 or 4 million Venezuelans. That is about 10% of the country's population. So that would be the equivalent of the US taking in 30 million people. Colombia did, and they said, okay, we can't just keep them in Venezuela where elections are not free. The government is starving them, so it's just a humane thing to do. So as they were coming in, they started to develop institutional help to find them a way into Colombian society. So that just happened in the last 5 years. So the countries do that. If the US, with the resources that we have, wanted to take all those 30 million people, if Colombia could do it, the US probably could. The US just doesn't have the political will. The American people are not that generous. So, which means that we need to keep thinking about different ideas. Okay, so one of the ideas, I'm moving in the direction of giving you maybe my suggestions here. So the idea of climate refugee is not practical for those reasons that I just mentioned. So it probably causes more harm than good to the chances of the people who are trying to move away from difficult weather. Helping refugees who are fleeing political persecution is difficult enough as it is, even though the letter of the law says that countries have the right and the legal mandate to take them in. And yet countries go out of their way to do the opposite. So imagine if, with that, we now add climate refugees to the problem. Broadening the definition of refugee to add climate, not only would it not help those who are fleeing a place because of climate, it would probably weaken the chances of those who are running away from political persecution. Because all of a sudden, we've opened the door to more people. So for those reasons, I think that using the term climate refugee is probably not going to be practical for the people who most need the help. Okay, that's one reason. The second reason has to do with the fact that how do we determine that a person is moving because of climate change? How many rain events, how many times does your basement have to flood because we officially meet a definition of a law? That is very, very, very difficult. So, how many rapid onset events does it take? Or how many slow onset events does it take? So it's incredibly difficult to come up with some quantitative or qualitative criteria that anybody in court, any judge will say, okay, you meet the definition, we're going to grant you asylum in this country because you're a climate refugee. It really is too broad, and this probably is not going to stand a chance of passing. So that's the second reason why I think it's a bad idea. Another one is because of the way that the term has been used. The term climate refugee is a Western term that has been coined in the countries that have produced climate change, the ones that generate the emissions. So the discourse, when you use the term climate change, is to a certain degree a colonial or imperial language. Because we argue we need to take people in as climate refugees, even though they don't see themselves as climate refugees. We normally, when we do that, we are actually using real people as a political weapon to further our political agendas in our own countries. So if you really want the government to engage in climate policy, we tell the government there is all of these climate refugees who are dying and hurting because of the terrible things we do. So the people who are suffering do not want to be a political weapon thrown out when elections come up in the US and the European Union. They have lives, they have real problems, they might be dying, and they don't want to be part of a political battle between climate deniers and those who advocate for climate. So they're being used as a weapon, as a political weapon. They're being weaponized. So they believe that the problem now all of a sudden disappears, and the emphasis is placed on domestic national politics of the countries that created the problem in the first place. In a way, it's window dressing. People are suffering, they're climate refugees, I'm advocating for them, but my government doesn't do anything about it, and I can go back about my business, turn up the thermostat, I'm not the cause of the problem. And I'm sorry they will die, but I did what I could. I voted for the right political party, but politicians are bad. So that's the way that it's being perceived. So when we talk about climate refugees, we need to be aware that people who are actually moving because of climate in other places, think about it in those terms. Another reason, this map tells us how Americans feel about climate change. Do they feel that they are going to be affected by climate change? The answer is no, and that's what the colors represent. But if you ask them, will your neighbors be affected by climate change? The answer is, of course they will. Well, wait a minute. My neighbor's house, if my neighbor's house floods, chances are mine will flood as well. If my neighbor's house burns because of a wildfire, chances are mine will burn as well. What we normally tend to actually believe that something as fuzzy as long-term as climate change is something that affects people, not me, until it does. Okay, so that's very important as well. It's another form of environmental colonialism. Environmental problems don't affect me, they affect my neighbors, poor them. And here I am advocating for them. They don't really do anything about this, they're the problem, and yet here I am, well, do we really, are we really going to talk about, speak for our neighbors? Is that what our neighbors need? So there's a significant problem. Sorry, I'm getting stumbling here because I was going to go in a direction that I don't think I want to go, because let me bring you back. So, but there is a form of colonialism when we speak for the neighbors. The neighbors need to care about climate change because it's going to hit them. It's not going to hit me because I believe in climate change, so I'm good. So, okay. Another reason why we are really getting into trouble if you use the term climate refugees. We see people as a problem. People are not a problem. People are people. The problem is the problem. The people whose lives are going to be upended by climate change are people that have hearts, feelings, families, skills, plans. They want to live their lives. They're not a problem. The problem is that they can't do it. They might die, or they might not be able to realize those dreams in the place where they try to build a home. So let's just not forget that people are people. The people are not a problem. And when we phrase that discussion in terms of climate refugees, then climate refugees become a problem. People need to move, nobody wants them, but we need to get them out of trouble. So we need to really think about what those people that are being displaced really want and what they need. And we need to empower them with the tools so they can make those decisions for themselves. We need to give them the agency. So let's stop thinking about them as a weapon to play our political battles. Let's stop thinking for them, and let's stop thinking of them as a problem. They're real people who are smart, they know what's good for them, and they don't need for any of us to decide what they should do, where they should go. Our job, if we want to be able to help, is to build the resources that they might need to get out of harm's way. That's really all I think we should do for them, not necessarily try to solve their problems or get them to move beyond being a problem, because they're not a problem in the first place. Another reason why we need to be careful about the use of the term climate refugee is because if the problem is the fact that people are moving, even though people move all the time, but if we frame the problem as people moving, we forget that the problem is what caused climate change in the first place, which is the burning of fossil fuels. So really decentering the problem. So let's focus on getting those people out of trouble and finding a way for them to settle, and ignore the fact that if you don't address the causes of climate change, this is just going to get worse. So again, this is really a real problem if we don't solve the issue by thinking about that getting people out of trouble is the key here. And for us to get people out of trouble, we probably need to ask people what they want. One more reason why climate refugee is problematic. So those pictures are refugee camps. These are refugee camps of people who got out of harm's way. They had to leave their country because they were fearing political persecution because of their background. These are refugee camps in Algeria of the Sahrawi people. When Morocco moved in the 1970s, Algeria took them in. I said, you're here only temporarily as refugees so that you don't die, but when things get good at home, you go back. That was 1975. And they're still there. So if we actually accord people who move because of climate the status of refugees, we'll probably tell them, you're going to be welcome into this country, we're going to put you in these military quarters that we don't have a use for until who knows when. Fast forward 40 years. So I've had a couple of students. I have a student right now, one of my advisees was born and raised in a refugee camp in Tanzania. Her family is from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And her mother ran out of the country, literally walked out, eventually got a ride with a pickup truck, and eventually got out to the refugee camps until the political situation improved there. She was born in the camp, went to school in the camp, was raised in the camp, and her mother is still there. Well, would have been. So a Catholic charity brought them to Milwaukee. So we have a number of students who were brought in from those refugee camps in Tanzania, people of Congolese background, to Milwaukee through Catholic Charities, and she's the second one who's my advisee. So, but it shouldn't have to take a Catholic charity from Milwaukee to get a couple of people. That's a drop in that ocean of refugees. That's not going to solve the problem. We feel good because we're helping those people, but look at those millions. So if these people are climate refugees, we park them somewhere far from here, in Algeria or Tanzania, and we feel good because we're doing something to keep them out of harm's way, but we put them in a temporary settlement where they're not necessarily given the institutional support they need to start a new life in Tanzania, because Tanzania only takes them in temporarily until they can go home. Because we don't want those people to bring their culture in. What if they change their culture? We don't want those people to come in. What if they become an ethnic group? All of a sudden, they want to take a chunk of our country and make it independent. So those are some of the arguments that some of the jingoists will come up with. So the problem is people having to move. The problem is not the people themselves. And putting refugees in a refugee camp is not what the victims of climate change want to see. So don't call me a refugee, because if you call me a refugee and you try to help me, you're going to put me there for decades. And that's not what I want. So one more reason to drop that. So another one, I mentioned this earlier, is cultural genocide. There's many kinds of cultural genocide. National culture, when the entire country has to move. Regional culture. Imagine if everybody from Wisconsin had to move to different states, then we would lose an identity as Wisconsinites. A local small village that has a particular tradition, some celebrations and summer festivals, all those die, disappear. There is generations and generations of people that made those traditions meaningful. But when you move people, the chances that they will all move together as a community are next to nothing, because there's no country that's going to take an entire country in. They're going to be divided up and put in different places, and then they're going to have to blend into the society that takes them, and their culture becomes a matter of a museum exhibit somewhere. So we call this cultural genocide. And people are very attached to their cultures. They're very attached to what they believe is the right way of doing things. And if you move them up, they're not going to be around the people that they like to do things with. So that goes away in a generation. So I suggest that we probably should stop talking about people who move because of degrading environmental conditions as refugees. And maybe migrant is a better option. Because when you talk about people migrating, you normally give them some tools so they can start from scratch in their own terms in a new place. You don't park them in a refugee camp. You normally give them some resources to move to a new country or a new city, and then you tell them, I'm going to give you some help at first, but then eventually you're on your own. You find your job, you create your family, your association, keep speaking the language that you want, but you're okay, but eventually you're on your own. And that probably is a better term that will actually get us to kick into some really useful tools to help the people who move. So the International Organization for Migration actually suggested in 2008 that we move in that direction, that we drop the term migrant, climate refugee, and then we move in the direction of environmental migrant. So let's think about that for a moment. So if we use the term environmental migrant, what we're really talking about is groups of people who move because of changes to the environment. Okay, so nothing new there. But these are people who are forced to leave their natural habitat, the place where they grew up, or that they choose to do that because they anticipate that something is going to get really bad. So some people see the writing on the wall and they leave before they get hurt. So that's what we're talking about. And some people might want to move out of their home place temporarily until conditions improve. Some places can actually be made more resilient if we implement the right infrastructure. And sometimes the community doesn't have the technical, the financial resources So the best option is to move in the long run. And whether they move domestically or internationally, doesn't matter. Most of the moves will happen nationally. So that's important for us to keep in mind. So what this means really is that when we talk about people crossing international borders because of weather events, we're really talking about a small minority. So dealing with that problem is very manageable. It doesn't take too many resources. It just takes mostly legal tools and political will. Okay. The critical point here is that when we talk about helping people, we realize that the point is to help people move where they think they will get the help that they need and make sure that the help is there, whether that's nationally or international, that people make the decision. And again, most people will choose to stay as close to home as possible. So developing these legal tools doesn't mean that we're going to open the doors and the entire world is going to sneak in. Okay. So I already went over this, so I'm going to skip this presentation also in the interest of time because I really want to get your thoughts and your ideas. But very important, people who move by choice or by need. And normally the idea that by choice doesn't mean it's a capricious decision. It's one motivated by deteriorating environmental conditions. Okay. Another thing that is very important is that if you're going to give legal guarantees to the people who are moving, it's very important to realize that those guarantees, especially if you're looking at legal guarantees, causality is very important. Intent is very important. So suing Alliant Energy because your basement flooded on the grounds that Alliant is spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, therefore they need to clean up your basement, well, that's probably not going to fly in court. Because Alliant doesn't burn fossil fuels as they do so generously with the intent of flooding our basement. They do it so that we can power the projector so we can all be warm and comfortable here. So it is very important to think about the need to help people move for climate reasons, for weather reasons, out of harm's way. So the focus here is on the nature of the harm, not necessarily on causality. It's going to be very hard to prove that a rain event was caused by some individual, and they have to compensate you for that. Another thing that's important to think about is that helping people because of deteriorating weather conditions means that if it rains and you get wet on your way to the library, that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is helping people whose very existence, their livelihoods are threatened because of deteriorating weather conditions. So again, it's very important to think about that. We're not opening the doors to let everybody in. We're really opening the doors for creating mechanisms for people who are affected, being harmed by deteriorating weather conditions. And harm, the nature of harm is important. It's not just getting wet and catching a cold. It's losing your home, losing your life, losing your family, losing your culture. So that's the yardstick that we use to guarantee people's legal means to actually move freely, so they don't have to worry about complying with the law when they are really thinking about surviving. Another thing that is really important for us to think about is that the people who are being affected by weather conditions have some institutional means. They live in a country that has institutional resources. So the US, for example, has some legal guarantees. The US, the European Union, and Latin America, that I will get into in a minute, that allow for the borders of the country to be open to people who are running for their lives because of weather conditions. The problem with the law in the US is that for them to be given those guarantees, they have to get to the US first and cross the border. But that's very difficult, because if there's a flood or a fire that burns their house, probably their passport went with it. And they probably need to run from home as soon as possible, so they're not going to be able to go to the American consular office. They will first have to get the papers, then go to the Americans, and then wait for months, if not years, to be given the humanitarian visa. So the US does have some guarantees, but the problem with this is that for you to be able to get the legal protections that the US gives you, which is the opportunity to stay in the US for 18 months, if weather conditions back home make life impossible, requires you to violate American immigration law in the first place. So it's a huge contradiction here. To be able to comply with this climate or deteriorating weather environmental condition law, you are mandated or you're encouraged to violate immigration law. You have to get through the border without anybody knowing, because nobody's going to give you a visa into the US if you don't own anything. Because one of the conditions to be given a visa is you have to prove that you have enough resources, that you're rich, so that you're not going to cost any money to American taxpayers. So very, very, very difficult that anybody is going to comply with that. So, however, there is building this momentum to move in the direction that the entire world should probably have similar rules. So that when somebody needs to cross the border for weather reasons, for extreme weather events, that they do have some guarantees. So the Organization of African Unity, Organization of African States today, came up with some guarantees to help people who need to leave their country, so that they're welcome into other countries to keep them safe. So that's a rule that was passed in the 1960s that countries do respect, and that explains why my student could actually be born and raised in Tanzania, because Tanzania took in refugees who were, her mother in particular, who was fleeing for her life. So we also have the Cartagena Declaration, one by which the international community agrees that addressing the problems of people who are crossing borders for their life is something we should all work to guarantee. And this is very ambiguous language, but that we should all try to help people who feel that they need to cross a border to survive. We're getting a little more specific to climate events. There is a UN initiative called the Nansen Initiative that was passed about 8 years ago, by which the international community agrees that there seems to be mounting evidence that people will have to leave their homes because of extreme weather, and that many of them will have to cross borders. And that we'll have to do something about it if we want to help them. So that's what the Nansen Initiative means. So climate displacement. The world is looking for ideas to homogenize our response to this. The Global Compact for Migration that was updated in 2018 includes the need to help migrants who are displaced by weather events, extreme weather events. And Argentina last year passed a new law that actually grants anybody who's been displaced, who's facing serious life-threatening conditions because of weather events in their countries, to move to Argentina for up to 3 years, and that could be extended until weather conditions improve in their home countries. So Argentina, in that sense, is one of the leaders in the world. But there is a significant problem. Some people probably will not have a country to go back to. We're talking about disappearing countries. Probably within the next 50 years, Kiribati is going to disappear into the ocean. So it's a matter of time. It's going to be the first country to disappear, and the international community is discussing what to do about that. So what are we doing about that? What should we do? Okay, we do have a legal mandate. The countries of the world have a legal mandate to help people in desperate need. It's the Good Samaritan law. If you try your very best to help someone who's run over by a car and that person dies, and you use your medical skills properly and that person dies, if somebody sues you, Good Samaritan law means that you tried your very best, you did what you could, there's nothing wrong with it. Same thing, if somebody's country disappears into the ocean, anybody, any country of the world has the moral and legal obligation to save those people from drowning. So we're really mandated by existing law. And we have the duty to cooperate with those people and with other countries who might be closer but not have the capacity to help them. Legal matters, this might sound very simple. What is the state? State is a piece of territory. And I want to call your attention to that. According to the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, which is the founding principle of international law, states are sovereign to do what they want over the territory. But the territory is defined by land above water plus a next number of miles of adjacent sea. But what happens if your country disappears into the ocean? Does that mean the country never existed, ceases to exist? Does that mean that if the territory disappears but the people remain, those people no longer have a country, they're stateless? According to existing law, that's exactly what we have. Because if the country disappears into the ocean and there's people who survive, they're probably not going to have a government because the government buildings are gone. There is no infrastructure. But those people meet other of the characteristics of the state. They're still people. They still speak a language. They have a culture. So all of those are legal definitions of state. So this creates a problem for which we don't have a precedent, but we know it's going to happen. And we need to come up with solutions to this. So what are we going to do? Well, there is a principle of international law that is the presumption of a state's continuity. Many countries that we know today were once a colony. Once a colony decides to part ways, once a metropolitan country decides to part ways with their colony, international law allows for that, provided that the rights and the obligations of the two parties are very clear. Think about the UK leaving the US as an independent country. The UK can argue, I'm not going to pay any compensation because the War of Independence, the American Revolution, I didn't cause that, the Americans did. So I don't authorize the independence of the US if I have to pay compensation. So these are real issues, the breakup of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union broke up, Russia went one way, Ukraine went the other way. But a key issue that needed to be settled is who owns the nuclear weapons? Who owns the debt that the Soviet Union contracted? We lend the Soviet Union billions of dollars to try to keep it afloat. All of a sudden it goes. So there is this presumption that state will continue, particularly will continue to honor its obligations. So the people of Kiribati probably have agreements with other peoples of the world. They probably owe money to somebody in the world. And those who are owed money will probably want that money to be paid back. So crazy as that sounds, it's not so much the lives of those people that matter, is those contractual obligations that once were created that need to be honored, which means we have to have a solution for these disappearing states. So how do we go about this? The problem becomes even more acute because we have international law, 1954, which was also created in the context of the Cold War, when many people left their countries. This just happened in Nicaragua a few weeks ago. The government decides to revoke their citizenship. You leave my country because you don't like my government, you're not taking your passport, you're on your own. An agreement was made in 1954 that every person has the right to citizenship in a country, and every country has the obligation to grant people citizenship. So if Kiribati and when Kiribati disappears, who's going to grant them citizenship? If Kiribati, the government is not going to be able to do that because they will not have the means. So the world has a problem here that we need to address. Another one is the relocation. So when the day comes that the last standing island of Kiribati goes underwater, some people will probably survive. Most people will probably drown, but some people will survive. Then what do? We do have a moral obligation, the humanitarian duty to come and help, and they will not have a country to take them to. So who takes them? So big question that we need to think about. So what can we do? We probably should try to keep them in the places where they grew up, where they want to be for as long as they want to be there, and we need to do our very best to actually keep them there. The Kiribati people don't want to move. And most of them have been given options to move, and they've chosen to stay until their country drowns. And they know that many of them will pay with their lives. And that's their choice. So we don't have the right to forcefully move them out of their country, because for them, for the Kiribati people, home is where your ancestors are buried. You need to honor them, because you wouldn't be yourself if you weren't for your parents and your grandparents. And leaving them behind is leaving your culture. So that's very important for them. So we have no right to remove them from that. That would be genocide. It would be forceful genocide. So, but how can we make it work? So there's a few alternatives that we're doing. This is President Nassim of the Maldives. He's building a wall to keep the ocean out and the people in and dry. But we know that when we build walls, things get through the walls. And particularly when it comes to flood control, building walls doesn't solve flooding problems or erosion problems. It just flushes the water faster somewhere else, and it creates the problem somewhere else. So the Maldives will probably go underwater eventually. So that probably is not a good solution. What those people who are being affected by the disappearing countries are really calling for is for implementing traditional solutions. Why do we have to reinvent the wheel and build a wall if our low-lying countries have been at the mercy of extreme weather since our people got here? It's just the extreme weather is getting worse. But the reason why they are on these islands precisely is because they were pretty much sandbars that eventually were stabilized. When somebody said, we're going to call this home, there's some water here, and we stabilize them, in this case, by mangroves. Mangroves is probably one of the most effective natural solutions to disappearing islands. They hold the sand in place, they slow down the rising waters when they calm the waves, so that when they hit the shore, the erosion is minimized. And that will probably give them or buy them a few more decades in their countries. And many communities are doing this. These pictures, by the way, I didn't really offer credit, I apologize. These are by the Nature Conservancy. I'm sure that some of you give money to the Nature Conservancy, and that's where your money is going. Normally, school children are educated into climate resiliency by planting mangroves in different places on the beach. Well, you know, I don't know any school children who wouldn't like to miss class to go to the beach. Okay, so the key here then is that the solutions have to empower the people in their own terms. Keep them where they want to be, give them the tools to take care of their own things, give them agency. So there are rights, they have right holders, and we don't have any right to tell them what they should do. So we do have duties, however, and the duty is to help those in need. We have a moral obligation, that's a universal rule that applies in most moral systems in the world, and there is legal guarantees that claim that we're legally bound to come to the rescue of those who are in need based on our capacity, and we certainly have some capacity to help. So, how can we help if we really want to help? Well, let's stop calling them refugees because they don't want to go to refugee camp. Let's just help them build more resilient communities. They want to be where they want to be, so help them stay there. Don't necessarily give them engineering solutions that might have been developed to address erosion problems on the Milwaukee River watershed. That might not necessarily keep Kiribati above water. If these solutions that we just saw have worked quite well for centuries, they probably won't be able to keep the country with us forever, but they could potentially keep them, you know, on record for a little longer. And these solutions that are community-based empower the community, build community, and they build tradition, which is one of the reasons why people don't want to move. They know that they will eventually pay with a life, but for them, community is very important. These kinds of events build community, and they build them through participation. They don't really want anybody to come and save them. They want to save themselves. And I'm coming to an end with this. So migration strategies are a form of adaptation, but it should be a form of adaptation of last resort, because most people do not want to move. And our job, if you want to help, is to help people stay put, stay where they are safely, and to help them move if they make the choice to move. But keep in mind that most of them will choose not to move. Very few, a small minority, will decide to move. So, a couple of things just to conclude. I'm wrapping this up, and I really want to make sure that we have time for, I'm going to skip that because I already told you about Kiribati for a while. New Zealand, for example, has created a program to take in people from disappearing countries. They have a quota. Every year, they have the resources to take in a number of people. Very few of those that these quotas are intended for are benefiting from it. So one of the arguments is most of the people moving come from poor countries. Anytime a wealthy country opens the door, they'll come in. No, very few people. Sometimes it's one person per year, and normally that is a student like me who goes to that country, falls in love with a local, wants to stay, and they appeal to this law because it's the easiest way to residency. But it hardly ever happens. Most people will choose to stay in the place they call home. The US, as I mentioned, offers protections, but the problem with these protections is that you have to get to the US in the first place. I mean, if you're running for your life from terrible weather events, you're probably not going to carry your passport with you, and you probably don't have any money, which means immigration won't let you in. So it's a very difficult law to enforce. If this is a solution, a way to help the victims, you tell me how that works because I can't figure it out. So very few people have benefited from this, and most of them are people who came into the US undocumented because that's the only way that this can actually work. And these people are always at the mercy with the perennial fear of deportation because this is a temporary exception that should cease the minute conditions improve at home. So some people who have benefited from this since the 1990s are at the mercy of the president basically extending these for another 18 years. Because these are so few people, normally the president signs these without even knowing that they do that. Their system says, oh, this is a TPS, or whatever that is, okay. So they get another 18 years. Such a simple signature really has allowed for thousands of people to settle in this country and call it home. So we certainly have some resources that could help. Some form of technological cooperation would definitely be very important. And I think what's really, really critical here is that we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We created the United Nations for a reason. The UN is there to facilitate cooperation, to transfer the resources from those who have them but don't need them to those who need them but don't have them. So let's just work with what we have. It's proven to be good. The UN doesn't work well. I don't know anybody who would argue it does. How could it work well if we ask the UN to solve the world's problems and we give them no resources? Yes, but it works pretty well considering the resources that they have. I very often get my students in classes, oh, the government never works well. And I say, well, of course it doesn't. And they go like, oh, really? I mean, the government has, for example, the mandate to keep our water clean, but doesn't get enough tax revenue, so they can't enforce that. So many communities are drinking water that nobody has tested for years. So imagine in countries with low income per capita how the problem is worse. But we do have a lot of institutional capacity built through the UN that we can actually use. So in conclusion, we do have a moral and a legal obligation to cooperate, particularly to save people who are in harm's way. We have developed institutions to do that. And when it comes to climate, we are not necessarily having to reinvent the wheel. These are just people running for their lives. So let's work with what we have. The nature, the cause of the problem might be different, but the problem remains the same, which is that some people's lives are in danger. It's not people that's the problem is the problem. I really want to drive that home. We do have a number of principles that suggest that Good Samaritan, when people have to move or else die, we have the moral obligation to help. And we do have a body of international law that tells us that we must. So, we have the law, we have the moral record, we have developmental institutions. Some people believe culture and customs do matter, and we do have the mandate to help them. And building resilient communities is something that we can do. We might not necessarily be able to solve the problem of climate change tomorrow, but until we do, we certainly have the means to adapt and to help others adapt. So with that, I'll bring it to an end and take your comments, questions, or open it for conversation. So thank you very much for being so patient. As I mentioned, what I recommend hardly ever happens. So pretty much disregard what I said in the last 40 minutes if you want to know what the future looks like.
Can this apply to communism and countries that might not participate in world organizations? Because China is 1.3 billion people, we're 360 million people, you got Canada, you got the EU, and it's still, I don't think, surpassing 1.3 billion people. So if they don't come on board and they got a different agenda, it's not that the rest of the world's progress would be in vain, but it could be hindered by countries of the world that don't want to be a part and cooperate?
Yes, the argument here, so the question for those of you who might be home didn't hear this is, are other countries with resources like China or the EU also obligated? Is that fair?
No, China was basically your communist countries and people that don't believe in freedom of the people. So China would be, North Korea would be, I don't know which Middle Eastern countries are really repressive. I can't tell you which African countries are very repressive, but it would be those groups of mentalities that, because those are opposing forces, just like China wants to come in. They bought up a lot of Africa, and they're trying to persuade African countries and the nation to go along with their ideology because the United States is failing. Same thing I think might be happening in Latin America and South America, Central America also. So, you know, there's opposing forces to goodness. If we and our allies believe in the goodness, but you have other countries that I would have to say aren't God-fearing, a lot of them. I don't know. But if they don't have that morality to them.
Yes, any country. Yeah, sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Okay, yeah, so any country that is a member of the UN is bound by the same rules. So I refer to the UN framework because almost every country in the world is a member of it, therefore they're bound by the same rules, whether it be China, the US, or Kiribati.
Yes, I just.
Remember I told you the microphone died?
Okay, we have another one here. If not, I can let this one.
Yes, I just want to talk about the immigration, that people come to our border and illegally, legally, and our immigration system used to be just like New Zealand's, I believe, and also Canada. And my experience with that is I came from Germany in 1961. For me to come to USA, I had to pass a medical examination. I had to agree to serve in the US forces, which I did. I had to agree not to go on public welfare, and there were three possibilities. One, I could show that I had enough means on myself. Two, I could show that I had employment. And three, I had a sponsor. And I did have a sponsor. And things have changed now. My second question is, with the migrants coming across our border, legally and illegally, I believe the majority of them, with their modification, is political and economic. Can you give examples? Which groups come across our borders because of climate changes in their homeland?
Okay, so the question is who comes across the border for climate change? So one that is very easy, for example, is farmers from Mexico. The Colorado River doesn't reach Mexico anymore because they pump the water out to keep the green lawns in Las Vegas. So the people who did farming south of the border and did fishing, they can't do it anymore, so they just follow the water north. So that's a clear case. And part of the problem is not, I don't want to blame it on the people in Las Vegas, because I mean, everybody has the right to gamble, whatever they do. But climate change is making precipitation less reliable, so that is really exacerbating the problem of the flow of the Colorado River. So all of those downstream communities, all of a sudden, run out of water resources, so they can no longer sustain themselves, they can't make a living, and they need to move. Most of them move within Mexico, and some of them, they just move north. So that's a case of climate-related migration. But as I mentioned at the beginning, climate is not the only reason why people move. Those people probably wouldn't have moved had the US not kept all the water. So that is a political problem that gets worse because of climate that is a stressor. So and we have those problems. That's what we were talking about. We talk about climate-based displacement.
My question is specifically about climate migration within the United States. And there are a lot of areas in the US that have been drastically impacted. And two specific examples are, of course, the wildfires out in California and hurricanes, flooding in the Southeast. do you feel that there should be some sort of, well, when those kinds of things happen, first of all, typically the response is the federal government will throw money at those areas to help the people that have been impacted, which gets at your moral argument that you've made earlier. Do you feel that there should be a federal policy of some sort to address preventing people from moving back into those areas that keep being impacted? New Orleans would be another example. And if you do feel that that is something that we should be doing at a federal level, do you feel that there's any chance that that ever will happen in the current political climate?
Yes, so most people who have to move because of extreme weather will move within their own country. So we do have lots of cases in the US where people move because of extreme weather. You mentioned Katrina in New Orleans. Many people moved out of there. And the unfortunate answer to this question is that we don't know what the future holds because there's many moving parts here. So insurance companies, for example, will not insure against certain risks that they know are going to happen more often. They've done their cost analysis and they just don't. For example, it's very hard to get insurance against hurricane, flood, wind damage in some parts of Florida, which makes people just don't get insurance for it. But the state of Florida then does, because the state of Florida doesn't want people to move out of the beach area because those people are willing to pay more money, they bring tax money. So to make up for that, the state of Florida is trying to keep them there, even though they know that eventually those buildings will collapse. So it's very difficult to deal with this, because if you don't keep people living in harm's way, and you subsidize them living there by giving them insurance, then those people are not going to be able to fund the school system, or the infrastructure, or the salaries of the local politicians who then would have to move somewhere else, but they might not get elected. So there is all kinds of reasons why we don't necessarily have the best policy. Same with Katrina. So many people probably shouldn't live where they did. They moved, but then what do you do with some of the communities that flooded that some people call home? So the likelihood that those communities will flood again is fairly high. The infrastructure is better, but then the weather events are getting more and more extreme. So it's very likely that some of those regions will flood again. But how can you argue that, an entire community that calls this place home because of cultural, historical traditions, all of a sudden you're gonna forcefully move them out? So those are very difficult decisions, and as I mentioned, I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, I think we know, giving people information, you're likely going to flood. You're likely going to be hit by a hurricane. And then what? I mean, if we don't raise those houses, poor people will probably move in because the value will collapse and it might be the only place they can afford, which means then the victims of extreme weather will probably be the poor people. So then we have another problem to deal with. So these are very, very difficult topics. Very, very difficult, and those are excellent answers. I mean, questions. I mean, it's, as I mentioned, if we knew the answer, we already have, the 10 Commandments here. This is what to do. When the hurricane hits, you do this, 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 and that. But unfortunately, every community is going to be affected differently, and they're going to try different solutions. What do you do with the Southwest right now? We're growing food in the desert. People have been farming there for generations. How do you tell those people that the Mexicans downstream need the water too? I mean, people invested their lives in those communities around Palm Springs and the desert of California. We feed ourselves in the winter thanks to that water that no longer reaches Mexico. So how do you do that? Look at the Columbia River in Washington State. We dammed the river, which is causing the collapse of the salmon. And when we built the walls along the river, we created gigantic lakes to irrigate the east part of the Rockies, which brought a lot of people to farm where there was no water, but now there is. So we have a problem. The environmentalists claim we need to remove the dams so that the salmon can go back and forth, but if we remove the dams, the water will, because the physics go down, there is no water for agriculture in East Washington. And then there is another problem. There's a number of towns that evolved on the shores of those lakes that survive on fishing. They fish for salmon. The salmon doesn't reproduce naturally anymore. So the DNR has to stock those lakes so that the fishermen can actually catch the fish and sell it to the supermarket. It probably would be a lot cheaper for the community to basically take the salmon, and instead of throwing it into the lake so the fishermen could catch it, to just take it to the supermarket. But then the fishermen would go out of business. So, I mean, stupid and crazy as this sounds, this is exactly what politics is about. People who grow up doing one thing, they don't like to be told that their job is no longer necessary. Because that is telling people you're worthless. We don't need you. And that's why I emphasize people are worth a lot. People are not the problem. The problem is the problem. So the problem is not that people like to fish. The problem is what's not allowing the fish to be there. That gets us to have to find these roundabout ways to get the fish to the table. It has to be stocked at the DNR so that then somebody can catch it and sell it to the supermarket. So this is the nature of environmental problems. It's very logical if you know the history of it, but it doesn't sound very logical if you actually don't. And people have acquired rights, and people have the rights to their lives, or so they think.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Anybody? I'll make sure I get everybody who wants that.
I think the most obvious thing that we can see the climate change is the reservoirs in the West at the low level of water. Regarding climate migration, I want to point out that Florida, it's agreed upon that the climate has become more hazardous in sea level rising and hurricanes, and yet there's a great migration from New York to Florida. And I think the reason is, in spite of the climate change, the reason is a matter of people are getting older, they prefer a warmer climate, and the other thing is the level of taxation.
Yes, people make decisions based on many factors. Definitely, climate is one of them. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there was a question, there was a statement, and I agree with that. People make the choices that they want. And the key in a society is to make sure that they can, not to deny them opportunities. Okay, all right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for your patience, and thanks for inviting me twice.
Attention library patrons, the time is 7:56 and we will be closing in 4 minutes.
Don't worry, I'm here, I'll let you know. Thank you for coming, I hope you can join us next week. We'll be discussing I Ran at a Crossroads with Dr. Beth Backerty from Beloit Colleges.
Who's my boss, so any complaints you have about my performance today, pass them on to her.
Ask her for a raise.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.